the greater you are as a star player, the harder it is to become a captain on the field. And that happens for a lot of reasons. One, you buy the lie that it's faster to do it yourself, right? Which is true in the short run, it's wrong in the long run. Number two, the gap between your performance and your performance expectations and everyone else's performance is so big that you're likely to struggle more on how to reconcile it. For folks who are what we call dominant visionaries, they're just idea people through and through, but they couldn't execute on something if it bit them in the face, right? It's not gonna happen. They don't tend to struggle with this stage as much because they've had to figure out how to hand things off to other people because they couldn't do it. They couldn't be bothered to do it. But for folks who are high performers, high achievers, who can do it themselves, it's a lot harder because they develop that skill, they develop that knowledge, and they actually increase the gap between them and others as opposed to decreasing it. So that's one of the factors. The other one is...
Hello, Scott. Welcome to Master Delegator.
Hey, Kristy, I'm so excited to be here. I always get this like moment of anticipation before we hit record on a podcast because it was actually a podcast that totally changed the course and trajectory of my life. And so every time I get this like, man, I hope it can be that for somebody. And I think it will.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm so excited about our topic for today because I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs or business owners are going, to relate to the topic that we're gonna talk about. And I feel like, I've been in that problem as well. I don't want to preempt the topic, but I want you to introduce yourself first before we dive right in.
Yeah. So I've come out of just a really weird opportunity and experience of, despite the fact that I have not yet eclipsed my 40th birthday, much to my chagrin, I've had the opportunity to help around 20,000 different organizations to start and scale. And when you see something happen that many times, when you work with that many founders, you start to see patterns. There's so many different stories, but the reality of it is there's really one narrative, right? There's really one arc. There's one fundamental story that every single one of us faces. And that's great news because of all the different things to do and occupations to have, being a founder is one that's the most prone to being lonely. Right? It can be difficult to be at the top. It can be difficult to be out there on your own. And that doesn't really change even when you have a team around you. That propensity for loneliness, that propensity for isolation is often there for us as founders. And the real joy that I have is helping folks to see that they're on a map. Right? That they're not out in the middle of nowhere, that they're not in uncharted territory that no one knows about or no one can help with, that in fact, the problems that they're having are completely normal. And in being normal, they're also solvable. And that just serves as a huge, huge relief for folks. And we're able to map out the path forward because we know exactly where we are and we know exactly where they want to get to.
I love that. Wow, 20K founders. How old were you when you started, coaching founders?
Yeah, it's a lot. I started, we launched the company, actually we relaunched the company back in 2008, September 2008, actually. And in our first 6 months, the stock market dipped like 32 percentage points or something like that in the financial crisis. I did a lot of that work in the nonprofit sector, and we're doing more and more businesses toward the end, and then have focused almost exclusively on businesses later in Scale Architects. And I started Scale Architects at the beginning of 2020. So if I ever start another business, I'll give you a call. We'll short all our stock portfolio and we'll both make a ton of money in the process, I guess. Right. I'm 2 for 2 right now.
Wow. Because you have so much achievements even before you turned 35. So you were able to scale your own 8-figure business and then you sold your business as well. So what inspired you to become a high achiever entrepreneur?
Yeah. What a great question. I did not aspire to be an entrepreneur, actually. Looking back, you can kind of see it in the tea leaves, if you will. You can see these hallmarks, but I wasn't that like quintessential sell your candy on the playground, kid. Like, but I my dad gave me a great work ethic. I did a lot with him. But I started my own company, had my own job as a kid, mowing lawns. Actually, I was mowing a lawn for a doctor's office, which was a pretty good gig. I still remember counting the number of weeks it was going to take at $50 a week to buy this cool electric guitar. I never made it there. Gas and taxes got the better of me, but it was a really cool thing. And I had to learn about pricing. I had to learn about quality. You know, if I didn't show up, I got a nastygram from the doctor's office, like it meant something if we missed a spot or did something wrong. And I had to learn a lot of those lessons pretty early on. But frankly, coming out of that, I was very interested in ministry, and I actually moved to Atlanta, Georgia to be part of ministry.
Oh, nice.
And I was just looking for a part-time job when I met the gentleman who became my co-founder. And so very long story short, and we can go into it, but again, to make it short, I ended up helping him relaunch a company that he had sold and had to repossess and had just dwindled into nothing. And so I was thrust right into the deep end on it. You know, when you start something brand new, it's kind of hard. You know, there's a lot of things that you don't know about. When you resurrect something that's been destroyed, we had I think it was like $150,000 in debt that someone else had accrued that we had to pay back. We started day one with 87 customers that had already paid but didn't have any of their work done, which we had to staff and fulfill. And so it was a really tough start for us. And there were quite a number of days where we did not think we were going to be able to pull it off. But you know, by the Lord's grace and just a lot of grit and determination, we were able to do that. And it was in that process of just having to take the next step to survive as a business that
Right.
I actually fell in love with business. I really, really did. I love how organizations work. It wasn't until years later when I really understood the types of challenges that I love as an entrepreneur. And we'll get into those in a little bit. But just the idea of creating value, organizing a group of people to do that, doing it together, there's things that I just absolutely love. And what better place can you do that than in founders who are oftentimes making something from nothing?
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I have a lot of questions for you that's already in my mind, lined up in my mind. But I want to know, because, you know, you experienced something difficult, you know, as you were launching a business, right? Like, what kept you going? Like, is it your family, your loved ones, or is it just because you love just building a business and you love the challenge?
Yeah, I like solving problems. I really, really like solving problems. And so for me, like I'm not super money motivated. That wasn't it. Like building a $10 million company was cool because it was like a milestone, but it like the dollars didn't really matter as much for me. They're not as compelling for me. I'll put it that way. They matter, but they're not as compelling. But being able to take on really big problems and solve those, and being able to do that through, like, when you scale an organization, the size of the problems you can solve scales as well. Right. So for me, the growth was, we have this huge problem. At that time, it was, or earlier in my career, it was around churches and problems with the IRS and just really, really gnarly stuff that was taking away from their ability to focus on being pastors, being church leaders. At this stage, for me, it's about solving this thing that we call whitewater, this challenge of complexity inside growing businesses that causes them to fall short of their goals and expectations, that prevents them from being able to scale. Those are both really, really big problems. And so for me, what really keeps me going is the ability to make a dent in those, the ability to change how those problems show up, to overcome them, even if it's one client at a time.
Yeah, it feels so satisfying once you solve a problem, right? And it's not just about solving a problem, it's also impacting, you know, the other person that you are helping with, or the organization. So you scaled an 8-figure business, you sold it. What was your challenges during the time you were building the business? How were you able to solve those challenges?
Yeah, I remember sitting down at a conversation with a gentleman who is now a longtime coach of mine. It was before we started working together, and I remember telling him my biggest frustration is being blindsided. It felt like every time I figured it out, every time I figured out how to lead, every time I figured our strategy out as a company, every time I figured out how I needed to show up and behave as CEO, it changed. And I told him, I was like, we can go back. I don't need anyone to show me. I think we're a $7 million company. It was like, I don't need anyone to show me how to be a $7 million company. I need someone who can show me what being a $10 million company looks like. And because I kept, and I was young and dumb. And so every day it felt like, and there were a number of different factors that led to this, but it felt like I was walking off the face of the map, right? And I had a great map for what was behind me. I could tell other people what was there, but I had no idea what was coming up next. And for a while, like that was kind of exciting. There's some thrill and adventure to it. And then you can only step in so many puddles. You can only get whacked so many times before it's like, this is just if I keep growing, I know what that means. It means more stuff's going to blindside me, and the things are getting bigger and they're getting less and less comfortable. And so probably the biggest challenge that I had in those lines was, to make it kind of practical to put a number on it, it showed up in terms of profitability. So right around that $7 million mark, $6 million mark, we were adding about $1 million of revenue a year at the company, but we were keeping less and less of that every year. So our profit margins fell from 28 to 21%, 21 to 14%, and then 14 to 7% over the course of 3-ish years. And every, founder out there knows that's not a good thing, right? And even for someone who's not super money motivated, and we weren't real bottom line driven at the company, you have to have profit to grow. You have to have profit to survive. And the biggest challenge in that, and folks will recognize this, when you see a number, a problem, a challenge, anything, and you say, okay, we're going to do all this, it's going to solve that problem, right? And you come back next year, you go through strategic planning again, and that problem is still there and it's worse. And you're like, okay, here's the plan, we're going to fix it. Every year, we had a budget that put us on track to add percentage points to our bottom line. And every year we lost 7 more percentage points. And when you do that for 3 years and all the stuff that means a lot of projects failed. That means a lot of, things went wrong. It means a whole lot of not fun stuff. It meant a whole lot of infighting inside the team because, when you're winning, everyone's good. When you're losing, it's a lot harder.
A lot of pressure.
And for me, it boiled down to 2 really big concerns. One is, do I actually have what it takes? Right? Like, can I lead a company of this size? For me specifically, I was in my early 30s at this point, and had, built most of my skills as a 20-year-old CEO. Like, I just no idea what I was doing. But more universally, is it worth it? Right? Like, because here's what you'll find. If you have not found this out yet in business, it's coming. And that is, for years, I thought that if we could reach this next milestone, if we could be $1 million company, or we could be a $5 million company, or we could have 50 people on staff, or we could reach this number of organizations, that at that point, like, we would arrive. Like, we would make it. It would feel better. We'd be able to do such and such. And I had this idea that to make my situation better, I had to make my organization bigger. And what I found is that organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, they get bigger, but they do not inherently get better. And so every time we cross one of those thresholds, you kind of look around and say, now what, right? So I'm not an endurance athlete. The idea, one step after, is not fun for me. But I decided I was going to do it. I ran a half marathon here in Atlanta one year. And due to some poor planning, I'm not an event planner either. I ended up taking MARTA down and running it without anyone being there. My wife and kids stayed home, and that was fine. Like, it would have been great to have them there. But what happened was it's 13 miles, 13.1 miles. I got to mile 10 and I was like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. What in the world am I doing? I just hated every minute of it. No runner's high, just all wall. And so mile 11, same thing. Mile 12, same thing. It was just agonizing. I get all the way to 13.1. I cross the finish line, right? And it's like, I'm done. And then I realized I have a mile and a half to go to get to the MARTA station to get out of here. And so my 13.1 mile half marathon turned into a 14.6 mile marathon. And that's what it's like, right? In business, we hit this point where we're like, this is terrible, right? We watch language. This is not fun. But I have to finish. I have to get across this line. And once I get across the line, it'll be fun again. And we get across the line and we realize we got another mile and a half to walk to the gas station or to the train station. And you do that enough times and you realize there's got to be another way, right? There has to be a better way. And so, this is a really long answer to your question, but for me, it was that frustration of not knowing if I had what it takes and not even knowing, like, is this it? Is this really as good as it gets? And being stuck in that place was not somewhere that I like to be and something that I help folks get out of every day today.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I totally can relate to what you said, but I'm curious to know, how did you finish crossing the line, in the business, like the finish run?
Yeah. So during this time, and this was the podcast I mentioned at the open here that changed my life, I found out about this idea of business life cycle stages. And I found out from a podcast, a guy of funny Irish accent, I could say that because he's now a dear friend of mine. His name's Les McCune, but he's talking about different stages that businesses go through. And as he's explaining this, I mean, it's like the most narcoleptic idea ever. Like, it's boring even now that this is what I do every day. The idea that you're talking about business stages is really, really boring, but it's really, really powerful. And in listening to something as dull as business life cycle stages, I had this massive internal and emotional moment that someone actually understood where I was. It was the very first time when he was describing this stage called whitewater that I felt like someone actually understood where we were right now. Someone actually understood the problem. Someone knew about it and had a map of it, which meant that there was a way out, right? And it was, I call it my "you are here" moment. And by knowing that that was a normal stage that folks go through, it brought so much relief. That's what got me across the finish line. Now, there were things that I had to do. I still had most of the race to go, if you will, right? Or at least the last 3 miles. There were a lot of things we had to change about our organization to align our strategy with what was necessary and useful in that whitewater stage. Things that worked in the past weren't going to work anymore. And we had a lot to change, from people to processes, the whole 9 yards.
Right. Yeah.
But in doing that, in a single year, right? We had tried for 3 years to turn our profit around. In a single year of implementing what he had in his book, Predictable Success, we were able to triple our bottom line. And so that was it, right? It was that "you are here" moment that got us across the finish line. And in that process, something really, weird happened to me. And that was, as I was watching all of this change, I realized that what I loved, the problem I really loved to solve, once I knew what the name of it was the problem of whitewater. Once I knew what I needed to do, once I had confidence in the right steps to take and in the right order, that's what gave me the confidence that I needed to not only make the organizational changes, but the internal changes as well. I had to stop being founder, co-founder in my case, and I had to start acting like a CEO. And that meant a really big change for me, but it was a massive one and ultimately laid the framework for a successful succession.
I love that. Is the person you're referring to who had a podcast, is your co-founder now, or the person that
Yeah, so Les and I, he's my business partner. We together run something called the Scale Architects program, which is where we use a lot of the material that he and I have created around the stages that organizations go through and the stages that individual founders go through together to help equip coaches and consultants and to help founders to scale.
Right. Yeah. And then now you help entrepreneurs get unstuck in the managerial kind of phase in the business. Right. Yeah. And I know you mentioned earlier that, you've worked with 20,000 founders and there's this one common pattern or, problem that they all deal with. Would you mind sharing what that is?
Yeah. So having worked with that many, again, you see this narrative, you see this pattern, and this conversation can take about 6 hours, but we'll fast track it here a little bit. I want to lead off to say, if any of this is interesting to you and you want to know more, we've got all of it in a book that we've actually made 100% free for everyone. So we'll make sure folks know how they can get a copy of that. So if you have additional questions, it's all in there, and there's lots of resources. It's great. But the quick version is that there are 7 stages that every single founder goes through, from pre-launch to post-exit. It starts before you start in stage 1, which I call the dissatisfied employee, and it ends after you sell or go through a process of succession with stage 7, which I call the visionary founder. It's really what we set out to be from the very beginning. Right. Someone who makes a huge impact, someone who has time freedom and money freedom. All of that becomes possible in stage 7 in a really profound and meaningful way. In fact, there's far more meaning in stage 7 than we actually believe is possible when we're first setting out. It's really, really neat to see people get there. But what happens in between, right? There are, you know, if there's one at the beginning and one at the end, that means there's 5 distinct changes that are happening in the middle. And we tend to overlook that. We tend to kind of think, oh, pre-launch to launch, maybe that's something. And then once you're a founder, you know, if it's funny, if you look at a founder's business card, right? What does it say on as the title? It says founder and CEO, right? Mm-hmm. Even before they've launched the company, they are founder and CEO. Right. But the reality of it is, Kristy, is you don't actually step into anything that even remotely resembles a CEO seat until stage 5. Hmm. And that's not diminutive, that's not demeaning or anything like that. But if you were to go out and hire someone and say, hey, I want you to be CEO, their idea of what CEO is doesn't really even bear any resemblance to what we're talking about until stage 5. Because what happens? Stage 2, it's when you start, it's what I call the startup entrepreneur. And sure, you're CEO, right? No one's going to take that from you. But how much of your time do you dedicate to being CEO? Not very much. You've got to sell stuff, you've got to deliver stuff, and you got to manage people, right? And that just consumes all of your time and then all of your time again, right? That's where you go from working 40 hours for someone else to 80 hours working for yourself, right? That startup entrepreneur phase, and again, I'll just go through these quickly. If you get it right, you figure it out, you sell to the right people, you get enough work coming in, you pretty quickly realize I can't do all this myself. And so once you've hired a handful of folks to help you out, they might be contractors like smart VAs, they might be employees, whatever it may be. Once you've got a handful of folks that you now have to manage, what ends up happening is you wake up, it's usually a Monday morning, and you wake up, you've worked all weekend, and you're looking at the amount that you have to sell just to cover payroll or whatever it may be, and you think, what's wrong with these people? Because the folks that you've hired don't think like you, they don't act like you, they don't look like you, they don't make decisions like you do, they don't take ownership like you do, right? They don't solve problems like you do. And there's this resentment that builds up toward the people that we've hired. And what's happened is you've moved from this startup entrepreneur phase where it's really all about you and what you can accomplish, and you hire people to help you get a lot more done, to stage 3, which is called the reluctant manager, right? Where it's not really all about you anymore. You're still on the field. You still have a job to do, but it's one of many. And so your role is to keep your job moving, which is pretty hard in and of itself, but your role is equally to keep everybody else's job moving as well. And if you were to poll founders and say, how many of you started your company to manage a group of 10 people, right? Like you would get 0 out of end results. It doesn't matter how many people you poll, none of them are going to say that's the reason. Nobody gets into starting their own business, taking all that risk so that they can manage folks. It's not why we start things. And so there's this sense of like, I would be able to do my work if I didn't have to manage these folks. Mm-hmm. That's the definition of a reluctant manager. And unfortunately, that mindset's going to hold you back.
Are you sick and tired of being overwhelmed and afraid you'll never scale your business? Meet Smart VAs. Unlike many virtual assistant agencies that only assign one dedicated virtual assistant, we provide flexibility for growing businesses by assigning a team of experienced virtual assistants that can do different tasks to support your continuous growth. Visit smartvas.online to book a free discovery call and start growing your business.
from step 1 to step 7, there are 7 steps, right? How long does it usually take to get from step 1 to step 7?
Yeah. There is not a fixed time frame. I can give some generalities, but it really, a couple things. There's no imperative that you have to get to stage 7. So for many folks, like myself, I'm intentionally structuring my business in a way that does not force me into stage 3. And I know how to do stage 3. I've done stage 3 before. I know how to get through it. I train people in stage 3. It's just not how I want to spend my time. So for me, I know that I can create the kind of impact that I want, at least right now and for the foreseeable future, by staying in stage 2. So you don't have to get to the next stage. The next stage is not inherently better. In fact, if you go from stage 2 to stage 3, it feels worse. And spoiler alert, if you go from stage 3 to stage 4, it feels worse again. So like this idea that we have to get to the next level, you might want to know what that next level is before you go charging into it, because it might not be as fun as what you're experiencing right now. Even nuts and bolts. If you optimize for stage 2, you can make more than most people do in stage 3. So this whole idea that we have to get bigger for it to get better it's complete nonsense. So because of that, there's not like a fixed time to stage 7, because you may never need to get that far.
Right.
But in general, somewhere around a year and change in stage 1, 1 to 3 years in stage 2, 3 to 5 years in stage 3, 3 to 5 years in stage 4. And then stage 5, you can stay there for decades. Stage 5 is a really rewarding, highly aligned stage for most visionary founders. And then stage 6 is indefinite. You can stay there as long as you want. You've succeeded. You've been succeeded at that point. You're out of the business. Tons of time freedom, tons of financial freedom, and then you can get to stage 7 whenever you want. So minimum, it tends to be a 10, 20-year journey for most folks, but not everyone has to make it through all 7 stages.
Right. Yeah, because not everybody wants to scale, right? I mean...
And a lot of people who want to scale don't want to scale for the right reasons. Right? So many people, because I lead scale architects, folks come to me to scale, right? And the very, very first thing that I have to figure out with them is, do you actually want to scale, and why? Because things are much better right now, or maybe even just in the rearview mirror, right? If we just unwind a couple of things that got you in trouble, things are much better there than you're giving them credit for. And so it's just like being on a plane. Sometimes the closest exit is behind you. Sometimes the best stage for you is the one that you just knocked yourself out of. And many times it's just an issue of going back and learning to understand the rules of that stage a little bit better so you can optimize for it.
I love that. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that, most founders, they get lonely. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's for some good reasons and for some bad reasons. I know for me personally, and I see this in a lot of my clients, there's this sense of like, if it's to be, it's up to me. If there's a problem to be solved, I'm going to solve it. And some of that is just some of that's in us from birth, but some of that's hardwired in those early stages, because if you're the only one working for your company and you don't figure something out, it's not going to get figured out. Like, you have to develop that mindset and those skills. So a big part of it is that those first 2 stages are so hard and they shape us so profoundly that when we get into later stages, when we have a team around us and we don't need to feel as lonely, right? Even in a practical day-to-day sense, we actually reject that. We resent that because it doesn't look exactly like we think it will, or we under acknowledge the degree to which those early years shaped us. So some of it is we're hanging on to strategies from the past. Some of it is wiring. Some of it is just the mechanics of being at the top of an org chart, right? I remember, so when we first launched, I co-founded the relaunch with another gentleman, and he was CEO and I was COO at the time. It wasn't for about 5 or so years that we switched that to where I moved into the CEO seat. And there's a distinct difference. I was owner and co-founder that whole time, but when I switched from being one of the leadership team members to the CEO, there was a very, very distinct relational shift inside the organization. So I've had the luxury of being able to see that from both lenses, and it is distinctly different, right? A lot of folks who are executives feel a little bit of that, but it's nothing like that shift. It actually struck me. It was very, very surprising how big a change that was, because I was in the same company with the same team, and it was relationally very different.
Yeah.
So some of it is the mechanics of being at the top of an org chart as well.
Right, exactly. So I'm actually going to the Philippines next month to be with my team. So we're celebrating our 5th-year anniversary. So we're going to have a summer outing. And I told one of my team members, I need to look at the photos of our team members on the website, because all of their photos are on the website. There's about 70 of them. And I'm not part of the recruitment process anymore. I don't do the interviews and all that. So I don't really know them that much.
Yeah.
And so recently I started scheduling a meeting with, new team members once a month. And it's just fun to get to know them, even though I don't see them work with a client like closely. Just knowing their background, their history, and who they are, it's making me want to trust them even more, because I know them on a personal level. And I think when you're CEO, I think that's just the thing that you have to embrace. You're not going to be able to meet with everybody in the business, because you have other responsibilities, and you have other people who are meeting with those people who are making them happy and satisfied. But if you can still squeeze in a little bit of your time to get to know those people, especially if you're going to have a 5th-year summer outing next month.
Yes. Yeah, there's a limit, and everyone experiences. For me, the first time that this happened, I was walking down the hall and there was someone else inside of our office that I'd never seen before. I was like, "Who are you and why are you here?" They're like, "I work here," and it's like, "Oh shoot." So yeah, there's that feeling, and if you've gotten to the point where you're not part of the hiring process anymore, you'll experience that. One thing that I would recommend, two things that I would recommend. One is, as CEO, you should stay part of at least the very last part of the hiring process for as long as you possibly can, right? There's a limit to that. It's different for everybody. But for most folks, the number one way you affect the culture of an organization is by being part of the hiring process, right? Being present for the hiring process. And that culture is so very important at all stages, but particularly in what we call the fun stage of the business. So that's the first one, is hang on to it for as long as you can. Then once you can't anymore, then hang on to a small part of the onboarding process for as long as you can, which is usually quite a bit longer, because you're able to do, 5, 10, 20, 15 people all at the same time. And it takes way less of your time. And in particular, you want to make sure that you're spending that time on deep things like vision, mission, and values, because nobody can communicate those like you can, right? And so that has the dual thing of, one, you get to see their faces, so people don't look completely foreign whenever you're walking around your business or in, virtually or otherwise. And it helps folks to connect to you as the CEO, right? In one of the most meaningful ways that you can. Obviously, one-on-one is the most meaningful, but one on a few with a distinct emphasis on the vision and why the company exists and the nobility of the work that you do. That's a really, really special way to connect. And so I always encourage folks to again, hang on to the last part of the hiring process as long as you can. And then second, when that goes away, hang on to the first part of the onboarding process if you can, or an early part where you talk about the mission, vision, and values, both for your sake and for theirs. One of my favorite things about new hires is that they have new eyes, right? And so we would get asked some of the best questions, right? They were total dumb questions, like you should know better type questions, but they helped us to understand things through a totally different lens. And so I loved getting those new fresh questions, seemingly like simple questions from new hires. It was a really special thing.
Yeah, they're very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
at least at the beginning, because I think employees, they also have their own cycles, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, you're happy, and then after a year, you're like, I don't want this job anymore. And then once you get compliments, you're like, oh, I'm happy again. I love this job. And then you go down again, at the bottom. So it's like up and down, up and down. So yeah. So in the managerial phase, especially with the people that you work with or you're working with, What do you think is the reason why they're just stuck in that position?
Yeah.
They cannot become the CEO of the business. Is it possible that they are mainly gifted when it comes to like being the operator and they're not really like the CEO
Yeah.
type of a business owner, or maybe they need to hire a co-founder to become the CEO?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting thing. Wiring has something to do with it, and when you look at the vast majority of successful founders, and you look at those who progress, all the way through to stage 7, a very, very large proportion of those are going to be visionaries. In our system, we have visionaries, operators, processors, and synergists, but you have blends of those, right? So you'll have some folks that have a little bit of visionary and operator or something like that. So because of that, yes, wiring does matter. And what the wiring does is it helps us to understand where we're going to struggle the most. But it's going to be very difficult to convince me that wiring in and of itself is a full qualifier or disqualifier, right? A lot of folks will say, oh, you need to have someone else be CEO for your company. You can't do it. I just couldn't disagree more with that sentiment. And I think a lot of folks sell themselves short and they stunt the growth of their business because of it. So we kind of need to clear that out. Yes, it's a possibility. But what I've found of founders is if they have a compelling vision for their future, one that compels them to have to grow, doesn't matter who they are, how they're wild, they will find a way of doing it, right? It's one of the things I love about working with founders. Especially if you tell them they can't do it, right? They will prove you wrong. So that said, we can predict people who have a higher operator score of two things. One, they will likely succeed the most in stage 2. When you look at folks who have that visionary operator combination, they tend to just absolutely crush startup entrepreneur mode, right? They are the star players of star players. And it's like they think about starting a business and they're making $500,000. I don't know how they do it, but it's just, they just crush it. They're great at it because they're great at having ideas and executing on them, right? And just, they don't need anyone else. They just idea, execute. They are the ones who hit the wall the hardest in stage 3. And folks that lean on the operator style heavily as well because of something what I call the star player paradox. And that is the greater you are at something, the greater you are as a star player, the harder it is to become a captain on the field. And that happens for a lot of reasons. One, you buy the lie that it's faster to do it yourself, right? Which is true in the short run. It's wrong in the long run. Number 2, the gap between your performance and your performance expectations and everyone else's performance is so big that you're likely to struggle more on how to reconcile it. So for folks who are what we call dominant visionaries, they're just idea people through and through, but they couldn't execute on something if it bit them in the face, right? It's not going to happen. They don't tend to struggle with this stage as much because they've had to figure out how to hand things off to other people because they couldn't do it. They couldn't be bothered to do it. But for folks who are high performers, high achievers, who can do it themselves, it's a lot harder because they develop that skill, they develop that knowledge, and they actually increase the gap between them and others as opposed to decreasing it. So that's one of the factors. The other one is the actual skill of delegation tends to be lacking. So you are overskilled in whatever it is that you're doing. You're underskilled in the ability to delegate that doing. We see this in the sports world. The best players very rarely become the best coaches. The best coaches tend to be mediocre players who understand the game. And in understanding the game, they excel at creating other star players. So for founders, we don't necessarily have the luxury of not evolving, right? Of not stepping into that. We have to develop the skills. But as founders, we have just a profound ability to develop those skills once we understand what they are and that they're needed.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, time flies so fast. We're about to wrap up. But before we end this episode, I want to know if you could please share with us, how do you make sure that you are living a freedom-filled, lifestyle as as an entrepreneur or business owner, or if that is even something that you value as a person, because this podcast show is all about being successful while at the same time doing the things that you love. So there's balance there. So how do you make sure that you enjoy life even though you are scaling your business?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, freedom is multifactorial, right? So we take the classic example. A lot of people have no time and lots of money. And a lot of people have lots of time and no money. So which one is more free? And so a big part of it is defining what freedom is for you. But I would say, if you kind of rewind to this idea of the founder's evolution, to this idea of the fact that there are different stages, it is that the greatest freedom changes by stage. And the way that I describe it in the book, I use a different word. I use the word joy. This comes from me, not from the business world at all, but from a personal life experience. When we had our first two children, I was 25 and 27 at the time, both boys, and they were awesome. But the first couple of years of my life, I had no idea what to do with them. Just no idea what to. I loved them to pieces. I thought they were really cool. I was like, what do I do with my hands? I have no idea. And so I kind of deferred that time and just said, Mom, give them back whenever they can kick a ball or something. We'll have a blast. And again, it wasn't an absentee dad, but I didn't really grab hold of what those years could be. Well, fast forward about 10 years and a whole lot of life and death and everything else happening in between. We had our third child. Her name's Isabel. And I remember when we brought her home, I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to miss the first 2 years. I'm not going to do that again. And so nothing changed. Still a guy, still have a job, still all of these things. Nothing changed about my circumstances I should change, but everything changed about me. And I can't tell you how many times my wife has pictures and she mocks me with them, but I fell asleep with a book on my face in her room more times than I can count, right? Like I've laughed more times rolling on the floor with her than you can shake a stick at. I experienced more joy over the first 2 or 3 years of her life than I did probably the 20 or 30 leading up to it. Why? Because I chose to embrace the joy that was available in that stage. And so the same thing's true of how we evolve as founders, and that is every stage, and I actually list these out specifically in the book, every stage has a joy that's available to it. And the real, problem with it is most of us don't recognize that until it's gone. I work with so many people like, hey, I can't wait until I get to stage 5. And I work with all these stage 5 people like, man, I wish I was back in stage 2 again. I missed this from stage 3. So no matter what stage you're in, there's something really unbelievably special about that stage, unbelievably joy-filled. And if you can learn to focus on that, to keep your focus on that, you can find freedom in every stage.
I love it. And I totally agree. Freedom means different for each individual, right? So thank you so much, Scott, for sharing a lot of value in this episode. I feel like we can go on and on, but somehow we have to end our episode. So where can people find you online, and where can they find the book that you're talking about?
Yes. If you head to scalearchitects.com/founders, scalearchitects.com/founders, you can get a copy of the full-length book there in PDF for free. Download it. It'll be super, super helpful. You can find us if you search for Scale Architects or Scott Ritzheimer on just about any platform. You'll find us there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time today.
Thanks, Kristy.